Hi all, welcome to CodAffection. In this video, we will discuss the complete master detail CRUD operations with React.js using a restaurant app. In previous video, I have already created an API for the same restaurant app in ASP.NET Core Web API, where we have already discussed the DB model structure with foreign keys using Entity Framework Core. And also we have tested the proper working of those web methods for this master detail CRUD operation. If you already know ASP.NET Core Web API, I strongly recommend you to watch that video first. If you want to replace ASP.NET Core Web API with other frameworks API, you can start with this video itself. So that was the intention while splitting these videos into API part and the client-side React.js. So in whatever situation you are, you can easily follow rest of the discussion from here onwards. Before getting into this topic, I would like to thank for your PayPal donations for my previous works. In order to make more helpful and quality tutorials like this, you can also support me through PayPal. I have given the link in video description and inside the first comment of this video. At the end of this tutorial, I have given some bonus points, which includes best practices that I have learned from building this entire project. And this video is sponsored by Kite, the AI-powered coding assistant, which is a free plugin that uses advanced machine learning for suggesting code completions. Currently, it supports many programming languages including Python, Java, JavaScript. You could easily integrate Kite with text editors like Visual Studio Code, Atom, PyCharm, Sublime, etc. It has a few cool promising features for faster coding. The key feature of this plugin is ranked completion. Suggestions are sorted or ranked by the relevance of the context rather than popularity or the alphabetic order. Completion from Kite are longer and relevant so that you could easily write full lines of code with less keystrokes, thanks to their machine learning algorithm. And last but not the least, if you are coding in Python, the Copilot feature offers documentation lookup right within the editor, so you could avoid frequent Google search outside the editor. We developers always come up with faster solutions for others. Why don't we try plugin like Kite to simplify our job? So I definitely think you should download this and give it a try from the link given below in video description. Before starting this discussion, let me give you a small tip. This video is around 3 hours long. So if you find any part of this discussion easy or slow, you can increase the speed of this video through YouTube controller here. Click on this settings gear button here, and within this playback speed, we have these much options to speed up the video. Now, without further ado, let's get started with creating React application. So here is the same folder where we have created our web API. And from now onwards, we will be using dark mode in both operating system and in all development tools, so that we can reduce the eye strains caused by the white screens to some extent. To create a React application, first of all, we have to open command prompt from the same folder directory. For that, you can use this shortcut. Inside this folder path here, just type cmd, then hit enter. Now, as you can see here, this command prompt is already open from the same folder directory that we have here. Now, to create a React application inside the folder, we can execute this command npx create React app. Then I will name it as restaurant app. Hit enter. Based on your internet speed, it will take some time to create and install some default packages into this application. So please be patient. By the way, in our channel, we have already done a lot of React tutorials. You could check that in video description under related videos section. Also, I have given some premium courses links in video description. You could check that also. Finally, we have completed with the command execution. As a result of that, here we have the new folder with the project name restaurant app. Now to open this new project folder inside VS Code editor, first of all, we will navigate inside the new folder and then just type code space period or dot simple. Hit enter. So here we have the brand new React project. Now, before moving forward, let's run this application. For that, we will open a new terminal, then execute this command npm start. It will compile this application and run the same in our default web browser. So this is how the default React application looks like. Now back to the project. In this application, most of the work will be done inside this folder src. Inside this public folder, we have index.html, which act as the HTML wrapper for all of the pages inside this application. As you can see, inside this body part here, we have a div with the ID root. And this particular div will be replaced within this file index.js. This index.js is the root JavaScript file for any React application. As you can see here, the same ID root is mentioned to replace that div. So this div will be replaced with the component app, which is the default component in any React application. So here it is, app.js. The HTML elements within this return statement is responsible for the default view of the application here. Now let's customize this application as per our requirement. First of all, I will show you the structure of the application that we are going to build. For that, inside this src folder, I will create a new file, app.structure.txt. I already prepared the app structure in advance, so let me paste that here. I'm showing this app structure to give you a better understanding in what we are gonna do. This entire structure is manually typed, not generated through any software. When I was showing app structures like this in previous tutorials, most of you were asking, is there any software to do the same? I don't know any software in particular to create an app structure like this. If you know any such softwares, please write it down in comment section below. First of all, we have components folder. Inside that, we have this order folder where we have grouped every components related to order. So this component acts as a parent component. Inside that, we have shown rest of these components here. So it will be similar to a screen or a page component. Okay, I find this structure really helpful to see everything related to order inside a same folder. You can follow any app structure that you find suitable for you. So inside the index component, we have arranged rest of these child components here. The order form is designed within this component order form. We have displayed list of food items served in the restaurant in a table along with a search box, and that goes within this component search food items. And through the table, we can add food items into the order, and ordered food items will be displayed within the component ordered food items here. And finally, we will show this component order list within a pop-up dialog where we have shown all of the previous orders that we have made with a summary of them. And then we have a separate folder for layouts component like table, pop-up, notification. Those components will act as layouts for the data or the component that we are passing. And in this project, we have a custom React hook use form saved within this folder hooks. Don't worry if you are hearing custom React hooks for the first time. It is just a React component. It will really help us to reuse reusable design patterns in our application. Next, we have utils folder. Inside that, we will have helper functions. And finally, we have controls folder. Inside that, we have components for each form controls. It's really helpful to have reusable components for form controls like this when our application is form intensive. Sorry, we almost forgot the form layout component. So that's all about the app structure. Let's get started with the development. We will design this application with Material UI components. So first of all, we have to install Material UI into this application. So first of all, let's go to the website materialui.com. First of all, we have to install this package here. So let me copy this. Now to open the terminal, go to terminal, then new terminal. You can also use this shortcut here, Control Shift, then backticks. Now I will just paste the command here, hit enter. So here we have done with the package installation. For this application, we also need Material UI icons. So let's install corresponding package with this command here. Hit enter. Now that's also done. Along with this package, we also need to refer the corresponding icons style sheet. So let me copy this link from here. Then we have to paste that. Let me close this terminal. We have to paste that inside index.html within this public folder here. So I will just paste that inside the head part here. And finally, I'm also a fan of Robotophone, so I will just grab corresponding style sheet reference from here. Now let's add that just below this icons style sheet here. And I want to make sure we are using Robotophone inside this application. For that, you can go to this global stat sheet here, index.css. The font is already applied here. In order to give first priority for this font, I will just move this to here. Now with that done, let's start creating components as per our structure here. First of all, inside this application, we will be designing a form for order. So let's start creating required components. First of all, we need a components folder. Inside that, we need another folder for order components. And here we have the parent component, index.js. In order to create a React component, we can use this snippet here, RFC. Such snippets will be available once you install this extension here. Okay, now let's click on it. It will create a simple React component that we can work with, and that component will have the same name as that of the file here. Now let's create this form component also. Let's create a React component. Now let's show this parent component inside this application here. For that, open this app.js file here. Let's remove these default elements from here. First of all, we have container, which is from Material UI. Most of the time it will list the corresponding component within this auto suggestion here, and thereby we could easily add the corresponding import statement here. But sometimes we may have to explicitly add the import statement here. From Material UI core, we have to import container. Now I will set this property max width as medium. Now everything inside this application will be wrapped within this container, and it will take half of the screen width. We have already covered Material UI in great depth. I have given the link in video description. First of all, let's add a title showing this is a restaurant app. So here it is. Typography component can be added. Now this time the component is listed within this auto suggestion here. If you click on that, corresponding import statement will be added here. Okay. First of all, we have variant. I will set it as h2. So this will be similar to adding an h2 header. And let's align this in center, so that we can show this restaurant app. Now let me save this and back to the application here. Boom. So here we have the application header. Now everything will be added just below this header. So it's necessary to add a bottom margin. For that, we can add this property getter bottom. Now just beneath this, we have to show this order parent component. Instead of naming this component as index, it would be helpful to name them as order. Let me save this and back to the application. Let's add a tag for the component order. Let's add the corresponding import statement here. Inside components folder, we have order folder. Inside that we have this file index.js. From that we have to import this order. Since this path ends with index.js, we don't have to mention that. By default, it will look for the index.js file. So I will just remove this from here. Now we can import the order component here. Now within this parent component, we can show this order form component. So here it is, order form. Now select this auto suggestion here. It will add the corresponding import statement at the top. Now here is our form component. From this component, we need to return a form element. So here is the HTML form element. Inside this form, I want to prevent default HTML validation. In a default HTML input control, when we start typing inside those text boxes, it will display a list of previously typed entries like this. Personally, I don't like that feature. So in order to prevent that from happening, we can add this property autocomplete as off. Now inside this, we can have input text boxes like this. Let's add one select control here. Most of the time when we add form controls like this, for proper alignment of these form controls within this form, we have to style them separately. Width of these form controls and the margin in between them, so that we can have equal space between each of the controls. That will be done here. Normally in an application, we may have tons of forms like this. If we design those forms like this, we may have to repeat same code over and over again. In order to avoid that, we have this layouts component here. Okay, first of all, we will be creating a form layout component. Within that, we can design the form as per our requirement. And most of the time, all forms inside an application will follow same CSS rules. So with the help of this layout component form, we can reuse them throughout our application. Don't be confused, you will understand everything in a bit. So let's create this form component. For that, we need a new folder called layouts. Inside that, we can have this new component form.js. I have already prepared this form component. Let me paste that here and we can discuss everything in it. So here we have the form component and it returns an HTML form element like this. For this form component, we have already applied those properties like we have done within this order form here. Now, with this class name property, we have applied some CSS rules with this root object here. I hope you already know how to customize Material UI components. If you don't know, don't worry, I will brief that here. Still, if you don't understand, you can check out my Material UI documentation. Link is given in video description. So basically, you can treat this object like a CSS rule like we used to have in our style sheets. This style is applied to this form element here. And as per this nested rule here, every element within this form with this class MUI form control -root will have these styles. So its width will be set to 90% and then the margin will be set to 8 pixels. By default, theme.spacing of 1 means 8 pixels. If you replace 1 with 2, then 2 into 8, 16 pixel margin will be applied from all sides. By default, Material UI form controls will have this class applied. And through this parameter props, we can pass additional informations. Let me show you how we can make use of this props parameter. Now let's use this component within this order form here. First of all, let's import the layout component here. We have to navigate within this layouts folder here. For that, we have to go backwards to folder. So you could do this. Layouts. Inside that, we have this form component. Since it is exported with this default keyword here, we can't use this curly brace here. We just need to type it as it is, form. Now instead of this form here, we can use this form. Now inside this form, let's pass plain HTML input text box like this. Now let me save this and back to the application. Here we have the text box. If you inspect that here you could see that this input control is wrapped or enclosed within this form that we have here. So this input control is wrapped within this form component here. And whatever elements we add between this form here can be accessed with this props children property here. So this is a default property in React component through which we can access child components within it. I hope you already understood this destructuring syntax here. If you don't know how this destructuring assignment works, let me explain that here. Suppose we have an object like this. Inside that we have name, age, and then we have few more properties like this: street address, city. Now instead of accessing obj name, age or something like that, we can do this: name, age. So the value of name and age within this object obj will be assigned to this variable, new variable name and age. It works because this object obj has properties with the same names here. So name ABC will be assigned to this variable, age 25 will be assigned to this age here. You can access rest of the properties also, like street address, city, etc. If you don't mind their names, you can do something like this, like we have done here. We will be using 3 dots and then you just need to name it as you wish. Something like other. So the rest of the properties other than name and age will be added into this object, other. So it will be something like this. Inside this other, now we will have an object with these properties. Okay, we can name this property whatever you wish. In this case, you can provide something like this, address. Okay, so all of the address related property will be there inside this object. Hope you understood how this destructuring assignment works. So that is what we have done here. Whatever we have added within that component can be assigned with this children property, and rest of the properties will be there inside other. Now in this case, we don't have any other extra property added to this form here. We can do that something like on submit, and into that we can pass a function here. And this on submit will be there inside this other object here. And you see what we have done with the other object here? This operator here is called as separator. So this operator will separate all of the properties inside this other object, and it will be a part of this form element here. So with this syntax here, we can access extra properties than we have expected. So this on submit event will be applied to this form here. We will be adding the on submit later. For now, let me remove this. Hope you understood how this layout component form works. So the input element will be there inside this children variable here. Instead of accessing children from props, we can directly use children variable. Okay, everything works as expected. Instead of this plain HTML input element, we have to replace that with Material UI form control. We can do that in a bit. For now, let me remove this input control from here. All of the form controls inside this form will be displayed in two grid columns. So I will add this grid component from Material UI. So this is the container for the grid. So we can add this attribute container. Inside that we can add another grid. So this will be the first column. So we have to set this property item. Column width will be 6. So we can do this. Like this, we need one more column. So let me copy this and pasting below. Now inside these grid columns, we can start adding form controls. For designing form controls also, we will be using reusable components like we have done for this layout component form here. I have already explained that within this app structure here. We will be having all form controls within this folder controls. The reason for creating dedicated components for these form controls is same as that of the reason for creating this layout component here. Even though form controls can be customized into different styles, in a given application throughout the forms, there will be a common styles followed in all of the form controls. So if we can create reusable components for form controls like this, we can avoid writing same code over and over again. Even if you don't have any particular style for form controls, I strongly recommend you to follow this structure, because in future if you wish to change the styles of these controls here, you just need to do that at one place. Now let's create these controls here. First of all, we need a folder controls. For now, let's create a component for input control. Now I will paste the component code here that I have been using in previous projects so that we can save a lot of time here. In order to display a text box, we will be using text field component from Material UI. And here we have the component input with the parameter props. Through these props, we can access these much properties. If there is any extra properties, that will be there within this other object. Now from this component, we have returned Material UI component text field. Here we have set the variant property as outlined. So the text box will look like this. Hope you understood this syntax here. If there is no value within this variant variable here, this outline will be used as default. So in all of the form controls, we don't need to pass value for this property variant. By default, this outline will be applied and thereby the text box will have this style. Suppose there is a unique requirement for this text box. In that case, within this variant property, we just need to pass field. So with this OR operator here, we can pass a default value like this. Here we have the label that will be shown along with the text box like this. And then we have the name for the text box, then value inside the text box, then onChange event will be handled with this function onChange. Will be passing that from our form. If there is any extra properties passed, that will be accessed with this other object here, and then it will be applied to the same component here with the help of this operator. And there is one more object, error. We will discuss that while validating our form. Okay, now let me save this and back to the order form here. Let's import that here. Controls, inside that we have input, and we will import the same here. Now let's use that here, input, and with this text box we will be showing order number. So I will set the label as order number, the name order number. Okay, that's enough. Let me save this and back to the application here. Boom. So here we have the text box for order number. As you know, the order number is auto-generated by the system, so we have to disable that from preventing user inputs. So we just need to pass disabled here, so which is a property for this text field, material UI component text field, to disable this component. So when we pass disabled here, as you can see here, it's a Boolean property. So when we pass disabled like this, it is similar to passing true like this. Most of the time, in short, we will just pass disabled. So that property will be accessed with this other object, and it will be separated here, and the same will be applied to this text field here, and thereby this text field is disabled now. We can't do anything inside that. Currently it is disabled. Now like this, we need 3 more controls inside this form. 2 dropdowns, one for customer and one for payment method, and finally we need a text box for grand total. We can add the grand total with the input control we have here. So let's do that. I will just copy this input control from here, then I will paste that inside this second column, grid column here. Grand total is also computed by the system, so we will disable that. Grand total, and then corresponding name will be gtotal. Now we need to add 2 dropdowns for customer and payment method. For that, we will be creating a reusable component select within this controls folder here. To speed up this development process, let me paste the code that I have already prepared. So here we have the select component with a single parameter props. Through it, we can pass these much properties along with this error object. Inside this component, we have returned this form control. Within that, we have select control from material UI. And this select control will look like this. Here we have the outer component form control, where we have set this variant as outlined by default. If you have a different style, you can pass that with variant here. And then we have applied this error object. We can discuss that while dealing with form validation. The label for this control is shown within this input label component, and here we have the select control. Actually, within material UI, we can export select control like this, and we have used this alias MUI select. Since we are creating select control, there will be a name conflict, so we have used this alias here. Within that, we have set the label. Here also we have to pass the same label, and then we have set the name, and then we have the value for the selected option, and then onChange function is set for this onChange event here. Within this options, we will be passing an array for showing inside this select control here. And that's why we have iterated through options to show menu item for each item or element inside this option here. You will get a better idea once we use this component in our form here. And finally, here we have shown this form helper text, which is related to error handling. We can discuss that later. Okay. Now let me save this and back to this component here. Let's import that up here. First of all, we have customer dropdown. So here it is, select label as customer. The name of the control, it will be customer ID. And then we have options. Within that, we have to pass a collection of items to be shown within this dropdown or select control. For now, into these options, I will hard code the array, and later we will be fetching these collections of customer from our web API. So here it is. So this select control expect the options array with these properties ID and then title. The ID property will be assigned to the value of the option, and then the title will be displayed within the select control. So we must pass those two properties within this object here. For now, let's pass some random customers here. Title as customer 1. Let's set this ID as 1 here. Now let's duplicate this. Now along with this existing customers, let's pass a default option here. ID will be 0, title will be select. Now let me save this and back to the application here. So here we have the select control. If you inspect this application, you could see an error like this. Find DOM node is deprecated in strict mode. It's an internal error in Material UI. In future versions, this problem will be resolved. For now, in order to avoid this error, we can remove the strict mode from this application. For that, open index.js. Then let's remove this tag from here. Back to the application, let's reload this. So let's check the console. Now it's working fine. Like this, let's add one more select control for payment method. So let me copy this and pasting here for payment method. Name of the control will be P method. For this payment method select control, we will be passing a hard-coded list of options. So let me save that up here. P methods, and here we have the array. Default option ID will be none, title will be select. Like this, we need two more options. This is cash. Both ID and title will be same. Card. Now let's pass the same here. P methods. So here we have all of those form controls. Now within this controls folder here, we need to add one more component for button. We will be using that later. For now, let's complete this controls folder here. Let me paste the corresponding code here. So here we have a button, and from Material UI we have imported button with this alias MUI button in order to avoid the name conflict. Into this component parameter we can pass these much properties here. From this component we have returned the Material UI button with these options applied. Unlike other control components, we have changed default style of the component here. So here we have the custom styles. Corresponding to this styles, there will be a class, and that will be applied to this class name here. As per these styles here, 8 pixel margin will be applied from all the sides. And then by default, Material UI capitalize all of the letters within a button, and we have disabled that transformation with this CSS style here, text transform as none. So this style is already applied through this class name here. Apart from that, you can pass extra CSS class with this property class name here, and that will be concatenated. If there is no such extra class, then this empty string will be used as default. In order to get this button style here, we have set variant as contain by default. And then default color will be used, and then a function to handle on-click event will be passed within this on-click property. If there is an extra properties, that will be handled within this other object here. And the button text will be passed as children, so that will be shown here. We will use this button in a bit. Now let me import this button inside this form here. Let me copy this and paste that below. And then from button, we have to import button. Now, in order to reduce number of lines used for import statement, we can do something else. Inside this folder, we will add a new file, index.js. And then we will do something special. Export from button. Inside this button file or component here, we have exported button. And that button will be exported again from this index file here. So we could do this default as button. We are using this default keyword here because we have used default while exporting the same from this component here. So whatever we have exported by default within this button file will be exported with this name button. Now let me duplicate this twice for rest of the components. Like this, we have input component. Like this, we need to export select control also. Now with this done, we can simplify this import statement here. From controls folder, we have an index.js file. We don't need to mention that here. By default, React will look for that file. From that, we can import all of these components all together. Select button. Now let's remove these separate import statement from here. That's it. So this is another trick. You can make use of it when you have a similar situation. Inside these form controls here, we have not yet set the value property. For that, first of all, we will create a state object. So first of all, let me import corresponding React hook function use state. Now let's create a state object like this. Values and corresponding set function set values. We will initialize that with this function use state. We have to submit this form into our ASP.NET Core Web API, and it expects a JSON object with these properties. Along with that, we need an array of objects containing selected food items. So we need to initialize this object with all of these properties here. For that, I will define a separate function, get fresh model object. From this function, we just need to return an object like this. So here we have the object. Now let's add these properties here. Order master ID, its initial value will be 0, and then we have order number. I already told you that this order number is automatically generated by the system. So I will define a separate function for generating that particular number here, generate order number. So here is the code for creating 6-digit random number. Now let's call the function here, generate order number. Then we have customer ID, it will be 0. Then payment method, in short or abbreviated as P method, initially it will be none. And then we have gtotal for grand total, initially it will be 0. And then we need an array order details, initially it will be an empty array like this. So here we have all of the properties that is required for the form submission. Along with this, I will add an extra property, deleted order item IDs. This property is required for update operation. Inside this property, we will be having deleted food items in an order. We will understand it later once we do the update operation. For now, that's it. Now let's call this function to initialize this state object values here. Get fresh model object. Now we can pass value for this input control through value property here. So we just need to do this. Value is equal to, we can access that from the state object values dot order number. Now let me save this and back to the application. So here we have the order number, random order number created through this function here. Okay, it will be a random 6-digit number. In a practical project, you will be having some different logic for creating order number. For example, a combination of branch code, company code, then a sequence number, etc. Like this, we have to pass values property for rest of these form controls here. Customer ID, P method, and then finally we have grand total, which is from this property gtotal. That's it. We have populated these form controls with their initial values. Now, when we change values inside these form controls, we also need to change the corresponding property value inside this state object here, so that whenever we select a different customer from these options, corresponding customer ID should be saved inside this customer ID property. For that, we can make use of onChangeEvent function. It will be there in all of our input controls like input text box, then select control. For order number and this grand total, we don't need an onChangeEvent because both of them is disabled. Now let's define onChangeEvent function for these controls here. For that, I will define a separate function, handle input change. As you know, for any HTML event, there will be a default parameter E. Now, inside this function, first of all, we will retrieve name and value from this default parameter here. For that, we could do this. We will be using a destructuring assignment like this. Name and value. Those two properties will be there inside this E object target property. Okay. So there will be an object target within this default event parameter. Inside that, we will be having these two properties, name and value. The name of the control will be assigned to this property. In case of this select control customer, name is customer ID. And then the current value inside that control will be there inside this value property. Now, if we were defining this onChange function for this customer select control, we could have done this. Set values, and inside that we can pass an object. All of the properties inside this will be passed as it is, and only with a change, customer ID. For customer ID, we have to set this new value here. Hope you understood what I have done here. So all of the properties current value will be passed here, except this customer ID will be updated with the new value from this property here. But in almost all cases, we will generalize this function handle input change for all of the input controls. In order to do that, we just need to replace this customer ID with this name property here. Now, before explaining what is happening here, let's assign this function to these select controls. On change is equal to handle input change. Now let me copy this and pasting here for payment method. Now when this on change event is triggered from this select control, customer select control here, these properties name will have customer ID. Since we have used same name within this values object here, customer ID, we can make use of that to update the same within this values object. So this syntax will update corresponding property within this values object. Okay. For payment method, we have p method as the name, and for this control value, we are assigning that from this property p method, and that's how we generalize this handle input change function. In order to do that, the property from which we are assigning the value must be same as that of the name here. Now let me define a function to refresh these form controls here. Reset form controls. It's a function without any parameter. Inside that we could do this. In order to reset these form controls here, we just need to update the state object values with the same object that we have initialized here. Because values inside these form controls are shown from this values object properties. We can call this function set values, and inside that we can call this same function get fresh model object. Now these functions and this state object can be reused across all form components. So in order to reuse these functions or state object, we will be creating a custom hook like we have mentioned inside this app structure here. We will be creating a custom hook use form. Unlike these layout components or controls components, we are returning functions or state object instead of some HTML elements. So let's create the folder hooks. Now let's create a new file, use form.js. I have already prepared the code for this custom hook also. Let me paste that here. We have named this hook with this prefix use. You could see the same with default React hook use state. So it is recommended to start naming hooks with use. This is also a component. Unlike other components, most of the time we will be returning states, corresponding set functions, and some functions. This is also a React component. It has a single parameter get fresh model object. Now to this parameter here, we expect a function like this which return an object with initial values of model properties. Inside this component, we have two state objects. First of all, we have the values state object. It will be used to populate these form controls. Along with that, we have another state object errors, we will be using that for form validation. Inside that, we will be saving validation errors corresponding to each form controls. Here, we will explain that in a bit. Now, here we have the generic function to handle on change event inside these form controls here. And then we have a function reset form controls to initialize form controls to their initial state. So inside this function, we will reset the values object and errors object to their initial state. And finally, from this component, we will return those two state objects and corresponding set functions. And then we have the handle input change function and a function to reset form controls. Now with this custom React hook use form created here, we can reuse them within this form component here. So let me remove all of these code from here. Now we will call the custom hook here use form. If you click on this option, most probably it will add the corresponding import statement at the top. Sometimes it may not work, so you have to check that. Now this hook or component expect a parameter function to initialize values state object. So we can pass this same function here. Now let's retrieve whatever it returns here. For that, we can make use of destructuring assignment like this. First of all, we have values, then set values. Instead of typing all of them here, you could just copy them like this and let's paste that here. Now whenever we create a form component like this, we can make use of this use form custom hook. Hope you understood how it works. I'm gonna make a major modification here. Instead of calling this custom React hook here, we have to call that within this parent component index.js, because these state objects or these functions should be shared with other order related components here. For example, inside this values object, we have this array order details. Inside that, we have selected food items for the order. Selected food items of an order is displayed or rendered within this component ordered food items. So this component requires this property here. So we must move these state objects or functions into this parent component index.js. From there, we can share them to other components here. We must do this because inside this application, we are not using any state management packages like Redux or anything like that. If we do that, this tutorial will become even longer. So I will just cut this line from here and let's paste that within this parent component index.js here. And let's move corresponding function get fresh model object. Let me cut both of these functions from here and let's paste that here. Now we can share these state objects or functions to respective components. Now let's do that for this form component here. First of all, we need to pass values is equal to values, and then errors is equal to errors. Don't worry about these errors and set function. We will make use of this error and its set function during validation. Since we are passing all of these objects or functions with the same name, we can use this short syntax. First of all, we will be having a pair of curly braces, meaning we are going to do something in JavaScript, and then we will pass an object, and whatever inside this object will be separated. So finally, whatever properties we have inside this object will be a property of this component here because of this separator operator. Now we could do this values is equal to values, then errors is equal to errors. Since we are assigning these properties from a variable with the same name, we can use this shortcut, just pass values. Now along with this, we have to pass handle input change function. Now whatever we have passed here can be accessed within this component with props parameter. Now I will do this. I will be using this destructuring assignment. From props parameter, we can receive whatever we have passed here. And we can make use of these objects or functions for designing the form here. Now back to the application here. Sorry, we forgot to import use form hook. So let's copy the corresponding import statement from this form component here and let's paste that here. Now it's working fine. Now before moving forward, let's start these input fields order number and grand total with a prefix. First of all, inside this order number, let's add a prefix with # or hash symbol. For that we can use this material UI property input props. Into that we will assign an object like this start adornment. Into this property we will pass this component input adornment. Let's select this auto suggestion here. It should add corresponding import statement at the top. Here we will set the position as start. Inside this we can pass #. Now let's copy this and pasting here for grand total. Instead of hash symbol we need a $sign. Now let me save this and back to the application. Boo. So here we have those two prefixes. Now if you check our custom component for input control here, we have not specified that property input props. So it will be there within this other object and then it will be applied to this material UI component text field. Now I'm going to style these prefixes here with CSS rules. So back to the form component. First of all, we will import make styles function from material UI. And then we can define a function use styles. And here we can call the function make styles. Inside this function we can pass another callback function with this single parameter theme. So basically within this parameter we will be having the default configuration of material UI theme. We can customize those default styles of material UI theme. We have discussed that in our material UI tutorial. Now here we just need to return an object. So we just need to do this. And I will name this style rule as adornment text. Into that we will pass an object like this. For now I will paste the CSS style here. I will explain what these styles does in a bit. Before that, let's apply this CSS rule to our adornment. For that, first of all we have to call that function here. Classes. Into that we can call this function use styles. Now let's apply this rule to this input props. Class name is equal to classes dot adornment text. Okay, now let me copy this and pasting here for grand total. So we have applied this CSS rule to this start adornment here. Inside that we have an element with this class with a nested element with this class here. You can see the same if you inspect this element here. See, this is the outer element. Into that we have applied our custom CSS rule here. Inside that we have an element or paragraph with this class. And the styles that we have passed is applied to this paragraph here. Okay. For more, please check out our material UI tutorial. Now let's add required buttons to this form. For that we'll be using button group. So it will look like multiple buttons grouped together. Now let's do the same inside our application here. We will add the button group within second grid column here. So we have button group. Inside that we have to provide a button. For this button, I'm not going to use the reusable button that we have created because we have applied some extra margin here. So it won't work with button group as you can see here. So I will be using default button from material UI. For that, first of all, let's import the button here. We have already named our custom button with the same name. So in order to avoid the conflict, I will use an alias name here, MUI button. Now let's use that here. MUI button. I will set the size as large. This will be a submit button. Inside this button, we will show this text submit. Now let's add our second button for reset operation. So I will just copy this and pasting here. Size will be small. Instead of a text saying reset, we'll be using a material UI icon. So we don't need this end tag here. And we'll be passing that icon with this property start icon. Now let's select an icon for reset button. I will be using this replay button here. Let's copy this import statement and we will paste that here. Replay button, let's pass the same here. And for this submit button, I will add an icon with this property end icon. For that, I will be adding an icon related to restaurant. So let's search that here. Let's use this icon. Let's copy this import statement and pasting that here. So here it is. So here we have the submit button along with reset button. In order to align this submit button along with these input controls here, let's add some custom CSS here. For now, I will paste the corresponding CSS rule here. Submit button group. So first of all, we have set the background color and the text color for the button group as a whole. By default, Material UI button text will be uppercased. In order to keep the button text as we have given, we have set text transform as none. Now let's apply this class to this button group. Class name is equal to classes dot submit button group. Now this is how it looks like. Let's add margin for proper alignment. Margin is equal to theme dot spacing function can be called. Into that we just need to pass 1, so 8 pixel will be applied. Let's check that now. That's it. Now along with this submit button, let's add a button to view all of the existing orders. We will implement that provision later. For now, let's add the button. For that, we can make use of our custom button here. We have already imported the same up here. Now let's use that here for the button. Inside the button, we'll be showing orders. For this button, we have to pass size as large. And we also need to assign a start icon. Let's search for a proper icon here. So we will be using this icon here. Let me copy this import statement and let's paste the same here. Now our form looks like this. For now, this is enough. We will be doing form validation and form submission later. Before that, we have to design UI controls for adding food items into this order. For that, first of all, we will be creating this component here, search food items. Inside that, we will list all of the existing food items. And along with that, we have to show customers inside this customer dropdown from our database. Currently, we have hard-coded this array in our application. Now, let's replace that with customers collection from our database. For that, inside our Web API project here, we have to make few more modifications. Currently, we only have one control, which is for order-related Web API methods. In previous video, we have already tested Web API methods inside this control. Now, in order to fetch actual collection of customers into this drop-down here, we have to create a new controller for this customer model here, so that we can fetch all of the customers from our database. So let's create a controller for customer. Add controller. From left panel, select API, then API controller with actions using entity framework. Click on add. Model class will be customer, and then data context will be restaurant DB context. Controller name will be customer controller. Click on add. So here we have the corresponding customer controller. Inside that, we have all of the Web API methods for fetch, insert, update, delete, etc. We don't need all of those web methods inside this application. We just need to retrieve existing customers to show them inside this drop-down here. So I will just keep this get web API method, this one. So let's remove rest of the web API methods. Let's run this application again. So here we have the get web method from customer. All of these web methods are from order. We have already tested that in previous video. Now let's try this get web method here. Click on try it out. Click on execute. So that's it. So here we have the response a collection of arrays currently inserted into the customer table. Now we can consume this web API method from our React application to populate the same inside this customer's dropdown here. Now before doing that, let's create one more web API control to fetch all of the food items served in the restaurant. We need to show that just below this form here. So let's create one more controller, add controller, select API, then select this template here, click on add, and corresponding model will be food item. So select food item, then we have the DB context, and then I will name this control as food item controller. Click on add. So here we have the controller. Now let's do the same like we have done inside this customer's controller. We only need this get web method for this application. For now, we don't need this rest of these web methods. So let's remove that from here so that we can keep this web API as simple as possible. Okay, we only have this get web method. It will retrieve all of the food items in the restaurant. Now let me save this. We are already running this web API here. Now in order to see newly added controller for food items, we just need to rebuild this project. Once it is successful, back to the application, reload this page. So here we have the new controller food item. Let's try this get web method also. Click on try it out, then execute. So here we have the food items served in our restaurant. We have already inserted these collection in our previous tutorials into corresponding tables. Now let's call these get web methods from our React application here. In order to work with the API, we'll be having a separate API file. You could see that inside this application structure. Sorry, we have not mentioned that here. Now it would be something like this. We'll be having a folder called API. Inside that, we can have this file index.js. Now, in order to make HTTP requests from this React application, we'll be installing a new npm package called Axios. So let's install that here. npm i4 install, then Axios. Hit enter. Now we have successfully installed the package here. First of all, let's import the same here. Then I will create a variable base URL. Inside that, we can save this web API base URL. So let me copy this and pasting here. Now along with this domain name here, in order to access any of these controller web API methods, we also need API /. So let me copy this and pasting the same here. Now let's create and export a function. Create API endpoint. For this function, we'll be having a single parameter endpoint. From this function, we'll return an object like this. Inside that, we'll be having functions to consume the web API methods. First of all, we have this function fetch all to retrieve a collection of records. So for this function, we don't need any parameter. And inside that, we can make this get request. Axios.get function can be called. Inside that, we have to pass the URL. Now, in order to pass this URL here, along with this base URL, we have to provide corresponding controller name. You could see the same here. In order to access any of these order related web API methods, along with API, we have to append order. And for this customer, we have to append API / customer. And same for food item control also. So this part will be passed through this parameter endpoint. Now we could do this. Let URL is equal to base URL. Into that, we can append the endpoint. And finally, let's add the /. Like this, let's add rest of the web methods. Fetch by ID. We can use this method when we need to fetch a given record. So for this function, we need a parameter ID, and then here we can make the get request URL, and along with that, we just need to append the ID. And then after this, method we have create. We'll be using this function for inserting a new record. So for this function, we'll be having this parameter. New record object will be passed with this parameter. And we'll be making a post request here. As a first parameter, we can pass this URL and then the object to be inserted. And then we have the function for update operation. For this function, we have two parameters, the ID of the record and then the updated values of the record. For update operation, we'll be calling putWeb method. First of all, we have the URL. Along with URL, we'll be passing the ID. And as a second parameter, we can pass the object with updated details. Now finally, we have delete function. For this function, we have a single parameter. Inside that, we just need to call this delete method. Inside that, we can pass the URL concatenated with the ID. So here we have done with the API part. Now we can make use of these functions throughout our application in order to interact with the web API here. You can use these functions in order to interact with the web API part even if you are not using ASP.NET Core Web API. Now first of all, we are calling this customer's getWeb method in order to populate the collection inside this customer dropdown here. I will do that inside this order form component. Now we will make the get request when this component is completely loaded. If we were using class-based components, there is an event called component did mount. Here we are using a functional component with React hook. Now in order to have an alternative method for component did mount, first of all we will be importing this useEffect function. Normally this useEffect function is used to execute side effects for a state object. For example, here we have a state object X and here we have the corresponding set function X. Okay, now let's initialize that with useState. Now with useEffect function, we can do this. useEffect. Inside that, first of all, we'll be having a callback function like this. Now as a second parameter, within an array, we can pass X. So whenever value of the state object X changes, we can execute this callback function here. As a second parameter to this useEffect function, if we were passing an empty array like this, it will be similar to component did mount in class-based components. So we'll be using this callback function to fetch all of the existing customers collection. Now let me remove this state X from here. Now let's import the API that we have created here. Import. Inside API folder, we have index.js file by default. It will look for the index.js file, so we don't need to mention that here. From that, we have to import this function, create API endpoint. Now let's call the same function here, create API endpoint. Into this function, we have to pass the endpoint. It will be customer for customer controller here, and that of this controller here will be food item. Now instead of passing plain string here like this will do the job customer. But instead of doing this, it would be better to create such endpoints in a different object here so that we can avoid typo while calling the function here. So we will do this. We will create a constant object endpoints. Now let's add properties with endpoints like this. So here we have created this constant object. Now we will export the same here. Let's import the same inside this order form component along with this create API endpoint method. Now instead of passing this hardcoded string here, we can do this endpoints dot customer. In this way, we can avoid the typo while typing this hard-coded string directly into this function here. And if there is any change for this endpoint, we just need to update the endpoint here only. So this function will return an object with all of these functions here. From that, we need to call this fetch all function, fetch all, And if this request went successful, we can handle that within this then function here. And if there is any error, it can be handled within this catch function here. Inside that, we can have this callback function with this error parameter. For now, we will just print the error message into the console. Now, if everything went successful, we can handle the same with this callback function here. So inside this parameter response, we'll be having an array of customers. But in order to show the same inside this customer dropdown here, inside this collection, we need to have ID and title properties like we have provided here. ID and title. So I will do this. Let's create a variable called customer list. From this response, we can access the customer collection with this data property. And through that array of customers, we will call this function map. And here we have the callback function. And from this, we will return an object with these properties, ID and title. So we will do this. ID is equal to item dot customer ID. And then inside this title property, we will be showing customer name. Item dot customer name. Now while naming this model controller here, I have named ID both letters in capital, and that of this food item model is like this, capital I and then small d. Since ID is an abbreviation, there are some confusion while naming them, but even though I should have followed a same pattern. For now, let's leave it as it is. So after calling this map function inside this customer list property or array, we will be having collections like this with these properties, ID and title. Now into that collection, we need to append this object here. So let me copy this object from here. Now we can do this customer list is equal to, we will add the object into an array, and then we will concat the customer list retrieved from Web API. Now, in order to store these collections of customer, I will be creating a separate state object, customer list, and corresponding set function. Let's initialize that with an empty array. Now let's call the same function here to update the state object, customer list. Now, instead of passing this hard-coded array here, we can just pass the state object, customer list. Let me save this and back to the application here. Something went wrong. Let's inspect this application here. So here we have an error. From origin has been blocked by course policy. If you have watched my previous tutorials, you must be familiar with this error. It's a security feature in all server-side Web API projects. So this ASP.NET Core Web API will block requests from another application which is hosted in a different domain or different port number. So that feature is called cross-origin resource sharing. In order to enable course or cross-origin requests into this Web API here, we have to configure this ASP.NET Core Web API to receive requests from this port number 3000. So let's enable course inside this ASP.NET Core Web API here. Open startup class here. Inside this configure function, we could do this app.useCourse function can be called. Inside this, we can have a callback function with this options parameter. Now, from options, we could call this function with origins. Inside this function, we have to pass corresponding client-side application URL. So I will just copy this URL from here and let's paste the same here and make sure to remove the / at the end. And then in order to allow any Web API method, whether it is get, post, put or delete, we can call this function here allow any method. And then finally, in order to allow any header configuration for the request, we can call this function allow any header. Now with this done here, let's rebuild this project. After successful build, back to this React application here, reload this Boom, that's it. So here we have shown all of the customers from our web API. Now let's create components for adding food items into the order. As per the structure, we have two components for that. First of all, search food items. Inside this component, we will be listing existing food items in the restaurant, and then from there we can add food items into the order. Selected food items will be shown within this component ordered food items. So let's create those two components here. And let's define this functional component here. Now let's create the second component, ordered food items. And here we have the functional component. Inside this component, we'll be showing list of selected food items. Now we need to show these two components just beneath this form here. So let's open this parent component here, index.js, and we will show them side by side. So we can use grid from Material UI. This is the container, and here we have the first grid column. We will split them into two equal halves. Let me duplicate this grid column here. Inside this first grid column, we will be showing the component search food items. And inside the second grid column, we will be showing the component ordered food items. Let's save this and back to the application. Sorry, here we have an error because React component return statement can only have one outer element. So I will just do this. In this case, we have two outer elements, order form and this grid here. So I will just enclose everything inside the grid. And then the ender 12 columns will be assigned to the first order form. Okay, that's it. Now back to the application. And here we will be showing list of food items in the restaurant. And from there we can add items into the order, and such selected food items will be shown inside this second half here. First, therefore, we have to retrieve food items from this getWeb method here. That we can do inside this component here, search food items. First of all, let's import React hook functions use state and use effect. Now we will call the web API method within useEffect function here. So here it is. Here we have the callback function. In order to execute this callback function after completely loading this component, as a second parameter we can pass an empty array. Now inside this callback function, let's call the web API method. For that, first of all, let's import corresponding functions. For that, I will import API methods here, create API endpoints, and the constant object endpoints. So let's call this function create API endpoint. Since we are going to make a GET request into this food item controller, we will be using this endpoint food item. So let's pass this food item into this parameter here, endpoints dot food item. From that we can call this function fetch all. Here we have the success function with a single parameter response, and we will handle the error response within this catch function. Now this get request will return an array of food items like this. In order to store this array, I will create a state object here, food items, and here we have the corresponding set function. Now let's initialize that with an empty array. Now inside this success function, let's assign the received array of collections into this state object here. So set food items, and the food item array will be there inside this data property. Now let's render retrieved food items. For that, we will be using Material UI list component. Inside this component, we will be iterating through this array here. So we can do this. Food items dot map function can be called. Inside that, we have this callback function with these two parameters, item and then the index. From this callback function, we just need to return a list item. List item component can be used to display a single item inside this list here. Since we are rendering these collections of list item through iteration, we have to set key property here with a unique value. So I will be using this index here. Inside that, we can show the text with this component list item text. We will set the text of this item with this primary property. So as you can see here, within this response array, we have these much properties. Inside the list item, we will be showing food item name. So we can do this item dot food item name. Now let me save this and back to the application here. Boom, that's it. Now along with this food item, we need to show the corresponding item price. It's already there inside this property price. So we could do this secondary is equal to item dot price. As a prefix, we will be adding this $sign here. Now the list looks like this. Just above this list, let's add a search box so that we can search through food items here. It will almost looks like this here. So first of all, we will be having paper component from Material UI. Inside that, we can have the text box. Unlike other text fields, we are going for a different style here. So first of all, we'll be using input base component from Material UI. Now let's set the placeholder. Along with that, we need to show a search icon like this. For that, we can have this component icon button. Now let's search for the icon here. Instead of this one, I will select this style here, two-tone. Now let me copy this import statement from here and then let's paste that up above. Now back to the application. So here also we have the same previous problem. Inside this return statement, it won't allow more than one outer element. So we can use this React fragment here. So here we have the open fragment and here we have the corresponding close tag. Now it works fine. For the proper alignment of this text box, let's add some CSS styles here. First of all, from Material UI, we will be importing this function make styles. And let's define the function here. Use styles and let's call the function make styles. Inside that we have this function. From that we'll be returning an object. For now, we'll paste this style here. I'm not going to explain these CSS rules here. It's already a long tutorial, so I will leave that up to you. Now let's call this function here classes and let's call the function use styles. Now here we have two classes. Let's apply them to respective components here. First of all, we have the paper component classes dot search paper, and the other class will be applied to this component here. Let's save this and back to the application. For now, that's enough. Now let's add filter operation into this text box here. For that, we are going to add two additional state objects here. First of all, we have search key, and here we have the set function set search key. Sorry, as per the naming convention, we should follow camel casing here. So let's use small s here. And we have to do the same for this function also. So I will just rename this. Now let's initialize this state object with an empty string. Inside this property, we'll be having the text that we have searched here. And we need one more state object, search list, and then corresponding set function. Let's initialize that with an empty array. So this is also an array like food items. Inside this first food items array, we will be saving all of the food items retrieved from our web API. And inside this array, we will be having food items after this search operation here. Now let's set the value for this input text box here from our state variable. Value is equal to search key. Now let's define onChange event directly here. OnChange is equal to, we will handle this onChange event directly here. When our value inside this text box changes, we just need to update the value inside this state variable here. So we can do this set search key. Into that, we can pass the new value from this default event parameter e.target.value. And when our value inside this search key changes, we have to re-execute the filter function. So we will do that with useEffect function. As I have mentioned before, with useEffect function, we can define side effect functions for a state object. So here we have the useEffect function. Within that, as a first parameter, we can have this callback function. And this function will be invoked whenever the value inside this state variable search key changes. So inside this array, we can pass search key. Now inside this callback function, let's do the filter operation. First of all, we have this variable. Into that, we will assign the retrieved food items from this state object food items. As you know, React state objects are immutable. We can't directly make modifications inside this object. So instead of assigning this object directly to this X here, I will make a copy of this array. For that, we can do this. So because of this separator operator, all of the items inside this array will become a part of this new array here. Now let's do the filter operation here. We can call this function filter. Inside that, we have this callback function with this variable y, and inside this function we will define the condition. So let's return the condition here, y dot food item name. Let's convert this into lowercase, and we will check whether this food item name includes this search key here. So we can call this function includes. Inside that, we can pass search key. Let's convert that into lowercase. Here we have the filtered array of food items. Now let's assign that to the state object search list here. So set search list, and let's pass the same here. Let me save this and back to the application here. Let's search for chicken food items. It's not working. Okay, here we have the problem. We are still rendering these food items from this array food items. Actually, the filter operation is done within this search list. So we have to render these food items from this search list. And we also need to initialize this list while retrieving the same from our web API here. Set search list, and let's pass the same here. Now let's check the same. Boom, it works. Now inside this list item, let's add a button to add food items into the order. So back to the component, and inside this list item, along with this list item text, we will add another component, list item secondary action. Inside this, we will be showing two icons. So we have to wrap them within this component icon button. Now let's select those two icons. Let's search for a plus button. Now we'll select this one, and let's copy this import statement and let's paste that here. So here is the first button. Now we need an arrow button. I will select this one here. Let me save this and back to the application. So here we have the button. Let's add some custom CSS to style these list of food items here. So back to the component, let's add a new rule here. Let me paste the CSS rule here, list root. Inside that, we have set the margin from top search text box, and we have set the max height for the scroll bar. And then here we have the mouse hover style. By default, the add button will be hidden. When we hover on a particular item, it will be shown. And here we have set the background color of the button when we hover on them. Now let's apply this into this list here. Class name is equal to classes dot list root. Back to the application. That's it. Initially, you won't see the add button. It will be displayed when we mouse hover on that list item. Now that's enough. Now, when we click on this button here, corresponding item must be added into the order. And the list of food items selected for the order is maintained within the parent component here, within this state object values, which is initialized with this object here. Inside that we have this array order details. Whenever we select a food items into the order, it should be added into the array here. Now we will define a function to add food items into the order inside this parent component here. So here is the function add food item. For this function we have a single parameter food item. First of all, we will define an object like this, and this object must have all of the properties for order details. So inside our ASP.NET Core Web API, we have this master table here. All of those properties are there inside this object here, and inside this array, each item should have these properties from details table here. Order details ID, master ID, food item ID, then price, quantity. So whenever we click on this button here, we are going to add a new item into this array here. So it should contain all of these details properties here. So let's create that object here. Order master ID is equal to, we can retrieve that from this values state here. We already initialized this with this object here, and the master ID is already here. So let's assign that from the values dot order master ID, and then we have order detail ID. We are adding a new item into the details, so ID will be 0. Then we have food item ID that can be accessed from this object food item ID. When we click on an item from the list, corresponding food item will be passed through this parameter food item. So the corresponding ID will be the food item dot food item ID. And then by default, quantity will be set as 1. Food item price, it will be there inside this parameter. So food item price. So these are the required properties that expect our server-side API here. Along with that, we are going to add one more property, food item name, which is not for the web API. We can use this property just to show the selected food item name inside the second grid here. So food item dot food item name. So here we have the object for the selected food item. Now let's add this into this array here, order details. For that, we could do this, set values. All of the existing property values will be there as it is, except this array, order details. Into this, we will be passing a new array along with existing details record. We are going to append or push the new object X here. So here we have the function. We have defined this function inside the parent component. Now let's pass that to the child component here, search food items. So we could do this. We'll be passing with this object syntax here, add food item. Now let's access the same inside this component here. First of all, we'll be having this parameter props. From that, let's destructure add food item. Now let's call this function inside the button click event here. On click, we will call the function add food item. Since we have to pass a parameter to this function other than the default parameter, we have to call this function in another arrow function like this. Into this function, we'll be passing item variable from this iteration here. So it will be corresponding to a food item. Now, if we click on a food item here, a new object corresponding to the selected food item will be inserted into the details array here. Now let's display selected food items inside this second component here. We have already created the component here, ordered food item. Now into this component from our parent component, let's pass this array order details. So here we have the corresponding component tag ordered food items. Here also we will be using this object syntax like this. So selected food items will be there inside this array order details, and we will pass this array with this alias name ordered food items. Oops, instead of equal simple we need colon. Now within the component, let's access the array. So here we have the component parameter props. Now let's destructure the props here. Here also we will be showing list of selected food items with material UI component list. So here is the component list. Now let's iterate through this array here. So ordered food items dot map function can be called. Inside that we have this callback function item and then the index. From this function we'll be returning this paper component. So here we have the material UI component paper. Since we are rendering these collections of paper through iteration, we must set this property key with a unique value. For now, we can pass this index here. Inside that, we can have list item for each selected food item. Inside that, we have list item text. First of all, let's set the primary text. It will be the food name itself. So item dot food item name. In order to style this primary text, we could pass this property primary typography props. I have pasted this property. So as per this typography here, this text will be wrapped within an h1 element, and then it will be applied with these styles here. For now, that's enough. Let me save this and back to the application here. Let me select a food item. Boom, that's it. Now to maintain a proper spacing between these grid columns here, we can update the grid within this parent element here. We just need to set spacing of the range 2. Now along with this selected food item, let's add a delete button. For proper alignment, we will be adding some scissors in a bit. Now let's add the delete button here. So back to the component ordered food items. For delete button, we could do this list item secondary action. Inside that, let's show an icon. So we need this component icon button. Now select an icon for this delete operation. Delete. I will select this double tone style here. Let's use this icon here. Now back to the application. Let's add a food item. So here we have the delete button. We can style these elements in a bit. For now, let me remove these ripples when we click on them. We just need to add this property disable ripple. Now let's define a function to delete a selected food item. We will define that function inside the parent component again. So here we have the function remove food item. For this function, we need two parameters, index of the food item and then the ID of the food item. We will need this ID parameter for update operation. First of all, I will make a copy of current state object values. So here it is, values. Now from this array order details, we just need to delete an object with this index here. For that, we could do this order details is equal to, and here we will be calling the filter function order details dot filter. Inside that, we have a callback function with two parameters. First parameter will be item and then the index. So here we have the condition. All objects will be selected for this filter operation except the item with this given index here. Since we are not using this parameter here, I will just replace that with an underscore so that you could easily understand it's not used in rest of the code here. So all the food items will be selected except the item with this index. Now let's update this array order details. For that, we just need to call this function set values. Inside that, we can pass this object x. Now let's pass this function into this component here. Now let's destructure the same inside this component here. Now we can use that function inside this button click event. On click is equal to, so we will call the function in another arrow function like this. Remove food item. Into that we have to pass the index of the selected food item and then corresponding details ID. So item dot order details ID. So it's not food item ID, it's details ID. We'll be using this ID during update operation. Now that's enough. Let's check our delete operation. Let's add few food items into the order. Now let's try this delete button here. Boom. Now we need to consider one more situation here. With this add button, we can add same food item over and over again here. Now we need to prevent this from happening. For that, we can do this. Here we have the parent component. Selected food items into the order will be there inside this property order details of this values object. Now if we pass the same array into this search food items component, we can skip the selected food item inside this list here. So let's do that. Let me copy this as it is. So we'll be passing the array with this alias name. For better readability, let's split them into multiple lines here. Now back to this component search food items. Let's destructure the same array here. Ordered food items. Food items inside this component is filtered within this search operation here. Okay. Now I will update this condition with the selected food items. To ignore selected food items, we could do this ordered food items. From that, we can call this every function. And here we have the callback function with the single parameter item. Inside that, we will specify this condition item dot food item ID is not equal to the ID that we have inside this iteration. So y dot food item ID. So this every function will run for all of the items inside this array with this condition. Here we are checking whether this current iteration item ID is already there inside this array or not. If it is there, this will return false and that particular item will be filtered out from this list here. Now let's try that here. As per the code here, it should have skipped this item since it is already added to this order here. This useEffect callback function will be invoked whenever there is a change inside this search key property. So this function will be executed only when we change value inside this search box here. In order to execute this callback function, when we select a food item into the order, we just need to add this array ordered food items into this array here. So whenever there is a change in either of these properties, this callback function will be invoked. Now let's try that again. Boom, that's it. So selected food item will be skipped from this list here. Now let's add controls for changing selected food item quantity. So back to the component ordered food items here. Along with this primary, we will be passing the secondary also. Inside that, we can pass those button controls for changing food quantity. So here it is. Inside this, we'll be having multiple controls. So everything will be wrapped within this React fragment. First of all, we need a button group. We will set the size as small. Now here we have the first button. Inside this button, we'll be showing this hyphen indicating this is for reducing the number of quantity. Now let me duplicate this twice. With this button, we will increment the quantity. And within this in between button here, we will be showing the quantity of selected food item. It will be there inside quantity property of this item object here. So we could do this item.quantity. And we want to disable this button. Now let me save this and back to the application here. Let's select a food item. So here we have the controls for changing quantity of the food. Now let's define a function to wire up these button click events here. Inside that we can increment or decrement based on the button we have clicked. So I will define that function inside this parent component here like we have done for this function remove food item. No, actually I will define the function inside this component itself. Because the function is specific to this component, other components won't need that function. So let's define the function here itself. Update quantity. For this function, we have two parameters, index and then value. Inside this value here, we'll be having either +1 or -1 based on which button we have clicked. In order to update the quantity of the selected food item, we need the state object from parent component, values and setValues function. So let's pass those things to this child component here, ordered food items, values and setValues. Actually, this function remove food item is defined inside this parent component. We can move that into this ordered food items here because that function also specific to this component. So it's better to define that function inside this child component itself. We can do that in a bit. Now let's complete this function definition here. Here we have passed both values and setValues. Now let's extract the same here. And here we can do one more thing. Actually, we have passed ordered food items into this component from this order details from values. Since we are already passing values into this ordered food items, we can remove this from here. And within this component here, let's define a new variable, ordered food items, and let's assign the array here, values dot order details. Okay, that's it. Now let's complete this function here. Now let's duplicate the state object into this variable x here. For that we can use this separator operator. And then we have to update the quantity of this particular food item here. For that we could do this x dot order details contains the array of selected food item. We can access the specific object corresponding to the food item with this index. Inside that we have the quantity. Now let's increment that with this value here. If this button is clicked, the value will contain +1, otherwise it will be -1. And finally we can update the state object like this, setValues. Inside that let's pass the updated object. Now this should work as expected. Now let's wire up this function into these buttons here. So here we have those two buttons. Let's add the onClick event here. On click. Let's call the function within an arrow function since we have to pass few parameters into the function. So here we have the default event parameter. Now let's call the function update quantity. Into this function we have to pass the index of this particular food item within this array. It will be there inside this idx parameter. So let's pass that here. So this is for the minus button. So I will pass -1 here. So it will decrement the quantity by 1. Okay. Now let me copy this and pasting here for plus button. Now here we will pass +1 or just 1. So the quantity will be incremented by 1. And in this case, the quantity will be decremented by 1. Now let's try the same here. See, it works. Now in order to prevent this zero quantity here, we will be having an if clause within this function. So here it is. So we will do this operation only when this result is greater than 0. So we can check that here. Okay, that's it. Now in order to simplify this function even more, I will do this. Let's move this line above this if clause and let's define one more variable here. Food item is equal to, we will save this food item into this variable. So let me copy this and pasting here. Now instead of this, we just need to pass food item ID. Now let's try that again. Now it's working fine. We can't update this quantity to 0. Now before moving forward, let's move this function remove food item into this component here. It's unnecessary to define this function here and then pass the same through this component tag here. So let me cut this from here and pasting the same here. And let's remove this from here. A small change, but it looks good. Creating all the functions inside this parent component and passing the same into child components is an overkill. We just need to define the function where it actually required. So in that case, this is fine because all of these state objects and this handle input change function is retrieved altogether from this use form custom hook here. In case of this search food items component here, we can move this function into corresponding component here. So let me cut this and pasting the same inside this component here. Now into this component, we just need to pass this state object and its set function. So let me copy this and pasting here. Now we don't need this function and we don't need this array also. We can retrieve the same from this state object. So let me remove this from here. Now back to this component search food items. Let's extract values and corresponding set function set values. Let's remove this function from here and we will be defining a separate variable for ordered food items here. Values dot order details. Now everything should work as expected. Now the parent component looks clean. Let's check everything works as expected. Now it looks fine. Now I want to make one more modification here. I want to add the same click event function for this button into this list item also. So here we have the corresponding component and here we have the list item. Let's copy this on click event and let's paste that here for list item. Okay, that's it. Now it works fine. Now along with these controls here, I want to show the price of this item for this much quantity here. So back to the component ordered food item. Along with these controls, I will be adding a span here. Inside that, we can do this. First of all, we'll be having a $sign and then we will do this item, which is the object corresponding to this food item here. Inside that, we have the quantity property multiplied with the item price. Now for styling these controls here, everything inside this secondary should be wrapped or enclosed within a div. For that, we could do this secondary typography props. Into that, we can pass an object like this and we will set the component as div. Now this operation will return a float number. We have to format that into 2 decimal points. For that, we are going to define a separate function or helper function which we have already mentioned inside this app structure here, utils. So inside this index.js, we'll be having some helper functions. It can be called anywhere within this application. So let's create this folder, utils. Inside that, let's create a new file, index.js. So here we have the function to round float number into 2 decimal points. Let's call this function inside this component here. So first of all, we have to import corresponding utils file here. From utils folder, we have this file index.js. We don't need to mention that here. And let's import this function round to 2 decimal point. Now let's call the same function here. Now let me save this and back to the application here. Oh no, we have some problem. It is saying not a number. Let me reload this page. Let's try that again. Let's add a new food item. It's not working. There is some problem. It should be related to either of these 2 properties, quantity or food item price. Quantity property is fine because it's already shown within this button here, disabled button. Now it should be related to this property, food item price. Let's check that. Here we have added this property, food item price, when we clicked this button here. So it should be there inside this component search food items. So here we have added that property, food item price. And this is coming from get web method of food item control. So here we have the problem. Instead of this price property, we have passed a property that is not there within this object. So let's pass price here. Okay, that's it. Let's try that again here. Boom, that's it. So here we have the total price per this food item. Let's start this list of selected food items here. For that, back to this component, ordered food items. Now let's add some custom style to this list of ordered food items and their controls. For that, first of all, we will be importing makeStyles function from Material UI. And let's define the function here, use styles. Let's call the function makeStyles here. And here we have the function with this theme parameter. From this, we just need to return an object like this. I will directly paste the CSS rules here. So this is for the outer paper component, and this is for group of buttons with plus and minus, and this is for the delete button here. And then finally, in order to style this total price per item, we have this CSS rule here. You could easily understand these styles here. Otherwise, you can check my Material UI tutorial. Now let's call the function here, use styles. Now let's set these CSS rules to respective components here. First of all, we have the paper component. So class name is equal to classes.paperRoot. And then we have this button group. So let me copy this class name from here, button group. And after that, we have delete button, then total price per item. Now let me save this and back to the application here. Boom. Now we have to calculate grand total based on the added food items in the order. That we can do inside this form component here, order form. So we will be calculating this grand total and refresh the same whenever there is a change of selected food items in the order. In brief, we have to refresh this grand total when there is a change inside this array order details of values. So I will do this. Here we have the form component. Inside that, let's add a side effect for the array. So here it is, use effect. As the first parameter, we have the callback function. And within this function, we will be calculating the grand total. And this function will be executed when there is a change inside the array, order details. So values.order details. And let me tell you one thing already. Now this won't trigger this callback function whenever there is a change within this array here, because we are defining this useEffect function for a nested property within this state object. Instead of passing the array here, we will be passing JSON string. So we could do this JSON, and from that we can call this stringify function here, and within that let's pass this array. So whenever there is a change within this array, the same change would be there inside this JSON string also, and thereby this callback function will be executed. Now let's calculate this grand total. For that, here we have a variable gTotal. Now here we have the array values.order details. From that, we will call this function reduce. As a parameter to this function, we can have this callback function. So this reduce function will execute this callback function on each element inside the array. And then finally, it will output a single value, and that will be set to this variable here. In this case, it will be the grand total. We will set that to this variable here. For this callback function, we have two parameters. First of all, we have this temporary total variable and then the item. Inside this item variable, we will be having the element on each iteration from this array here. And this parameter will act as a temporary variable for calculating the total. To initialize this variable with 0, we can pass that as a second parameter to this function here. So to this reduce function, first of all, we have this callback function, and in order to initialize this variable here, we have passed 0. Now within this function, we will do this return temp total, Into that, we will be adding the price of food item on each iteration. So item dot quantity multiplied with the food item price. So in first iteration, this will be 0. Into that, we will add the price of the first selected food item for the given quantity. After each iteration, this result will be saved within this temp total. So that's how this reduce function works. And like this, on each iteration, we'll be adding food item price into this temp total. After executing this callback function for all of the elements inside the array, it will be assigned to this variable here. Now we just need to update the grand total in our state object values. So set values function can be called. Sorry, we have not yet passed this set function into this component. So let's do that. So here we have the parent component. Let's pass set values here. Now let's extract the same inside this form component up here. Now we can call this set values function here. Inside that we can do this values, and then we just need to update the grand total, which is the inside this property gTotal, and let's pass the same here. This will be a decimal number. In order to round this number to 2 decimal point, we can call the same function here utils. Okay, so first of all, let's import the same here. And from that, we can import this function round to 2 decimal point. Now let's call the same function here. Now let's check whether it is working or not. Boo. So the grand total is updated whenever we make changes inside these collections of selected food items. Now it's time to submit this form here. Before that, we have to do one more thing, which is form validation. So in order to submit this form here, we must select an option from these two drop-downs here, customer and payment method. And most importantly, there must be at least one food item selected in the order. For that, first of all, let's define a function to handle this form submit event. So back to the form component, let's add on submit event here. On submit, and we will handle this event within a function called submit order. Okay, now let's define this function here. For this function, we have a single parameter, which is the default event parameter e. First of all, inside this function, we have to prevent the default behavior of the form. It includes reloading of this page when this form is submitted, or these form data will be passed through query string here. In order to prevent the default behavior of an HTML form, we can do this. e.prevent default function can be called. Now inside this function, we will submit this form only when this form is validated. And we will validate this form within a function called validate form. So this function will validate this form, and this function will return a Boolean value indicating whether this form as a whole is valid or not. So let's define the function here, validate form. For this function, we don't have any parameter. First of all, we will define a temporary object to save the validation errors. First of all, let's check whether customer dropdown is valid or not. Corresponding error message will be saved within this property customer ID. So we can do this values dot customer ID. If it is not equal to 0, meaning there is a customer selected for the order. So the customer dropdown is valid, so there is no error message. So we will be assigning this empty string. Otherwise, there is an error, and we will save this error message. This field is required. Like this, let's validate rest of the entities. We have payment method, in short P method. Let me copy this and pasting here. So within this payment method dropdown, if it is not equal to the default value, which is none, meaning there is a payment method selected for the order, in that case the error message will be empty. Otherwise, we will have this error message, this field is required. Now finally we have to check is there at least one item, food item selected for the order. For that we could do this temp order details values dot order details is the array corresponding to the selected food items, and we can check the length of this array. If it is not equal to 0, there is at least one item selected for the order, so error message will be empty. Otherwise, we'll be assigning the same error message here. Now let's assign this error object into errors state object that we have defined inside this parent component here. So here we have the state object errors for saving validation errors, and here we have the corresponding set errors function. I think we have already passed this into our component here, form component errors. Along with that, we need set errors function. Now let's extract the same within this form component, and we can call the same here to update the errors inside the error state object. And finally, from this function we need to return a boolean value indicating whether this form as a whole is valid or not. For that we could do this object dot values function can be called. Inside that we can pass this temp object. So basically this function will return a collection of values within this object. Sorry, instead of small o we have capital O, and from that collection we will call this function every. Inside that we can have this condition x whether it is an empty string or not. So this every function will execute this condition for all of the elements inside this collection. So if all of the values or error messages inside the array is empty string, this function will return true, meaning that this form as a whole is valid. If there is a property inside this object with a non-empty string, then this function will return false, meaning that this form as a whole is not valid. Now we have saved the validation errors into this errors state object. Now we just need to show the same to these form controls here. Don't worry, we have already done that in our reusable controls components here. First of all, we have input text field where it extracts error object, and for showing an error message inside a text field we can make use of this helper text. So here we just need to pass the error message into this error property. Inside this form both of these text fields are disabled, so we don't have to worry about validating them. Let's look how to show the validation error inside select control. So here we have the corresponding component. We just need to pass the error message to this property error. In order to show error message for a select control, the outer form control error property must be set as true. So this property will be applied to this form control when this property has a value. So here we have applied this property conditionally. Apart from that, we have to set the error message within this component form helper text. So that's what we have done here with this condition. So whenever there is an error message, this component will be shown, and thereby we could see the error message. Now inside this form, let's pass value for this error property here. So here we have the customer select control error is equal to errors dot customer ID. Now let me copy this and pasting here for payment method, p method. Let me save this and back to the application. Submit this form without populating these controls here. Boom. So here we have highlighted those controls with validation error messages. Now along with these two controls, we have to show there is no item selected for the food item inside this second grid column here. For that, back to this ordered food items component, and here we have the list, and let's show the list item saying there is no item selected. So first of all, here we have the condition if the array ordered food items length is equal to 0. So here we are going to use the ternary operator. Here we have the condition, and here we will be passing a list item with the message. And then here we have the colon for the ternary operator. So when this condition is true, this will be displayed, otherwise the list of items selected in the order will be displayed. Now inside this component, we can have this component list item text, and within this primary property we can pass the text please select food items. And in order to style this component, we can pass primary typography props. It will accept an object. Inside that we have this property style, and first of all we have to center the text. So text align is equal to center, and then we have font style as italic. Now let me save this and back to the application. That's it. Now finally, it's time to submit this form here so that we can make a new order. So here we have the form submit function, submit order. For inserting a new order, we will consume this web API method here, post from order controller. Now inside this component, we have already imported the API file or function create API endpoint. So here it is. Now let's make a post request into our order component. Create API endpoint. Into that we can pass this endpoint order. So endpoints dot order. From that we can call this function create. Inside this function, it will make this post request. Now into this function we have to pass an object which is to be posted and inserted into our database. So we can pass values state object. Inside this object we have everything required for this post request. Now if this request went successful, we can handle that within this then function here, and here we have the callback function to handle that. And if there is any error, we will handle that within this catch function, and here we have the corresponding callback function. For now, inside this success function here, we will just print the response. Let me save this and back to the application here. Now let's make our first order. Now let's keep this console window open here, and let's make our first order. Select the customer and then select few food items into this order. Submit the form. Sorry, we forgot to select the payment method. Submit the form. Boom, that's it. Here we have the response object with the status created. Now let's check that within my management studio here. Let's connect to the SQL Server instance, and here we have the tables corresponding to orders. And here we have the master table. That's it. Here we have the summary of the order within this masters table. Now let's check corresponding details table here. So here we have two rows corresponding to these two food items here. So everything works as we expected. Now back to the application here. Let's reset these form controls after form submission. For that, we have already defined a function inside our custom React hook here, use form. So here is the function reset form controls, and we have the function inside this parent component here, reset form controls. Now let's pass the same into this form component here. Now let's extract the same from this form component props here. Let's call the same inside this submit event here. Now let's look how to fetch existing orders into this application, and let's show them inside this application here. When user click on this button, we will open a pop-up dialog listing all of the existing orders. So first of all, let me add a reusable component for pop-up dialog. We have already mentioned that inside this app structure here, pop-up. So here we have the folder layouts. Inside that, let's create a new file for pop-up. Instead of creating this component from scratch, let me paste the code here and we can explain everything in detail. We already discussed dialog or modal pop-up in our Material UI tutorial. So if you find my explanation regarding Material UI is not enough to understand the concept, please check out my complete tutorial. I won't say that again in this tutorial. If you find any difficulty in understanding Material UI, please check out that complete 4-hour long tutorial. Now back to this component pop-up with a single parameter props. So into this component we'll be passing these informations. So this open pop-up will be a boolean variable state object, and here we have the corresponding set function. We will be defining those functions wherever we want to use this pop-up dialog. Whatever we have mentioned within this pop-up dialog will be the inside this children property. With this title property we can pass a heading for this model pop-up. And along with that we have some styles to this component, and it will be applied through this classes object. In order to show a pop-up dialog in Material UI, we have this component dialog. It will be displayed only when this property, state property, boolean property, open pop-up is true. We have set the max width here and we have applied some styles. And within this dialog component here, we can set the title for this model pop-up. So within this div here, we have shown the title property within H6 heading here. Along with that, we have a close button to close this window, and the real content will be displayed within this component here, dialog content. Now let's make use of this component inside this form component here. For that, first of all, I will be defining a boolean state object here, order list visibility, and corresponding set function. Let's initialize that with boolean false. Use state. Inside that we can pass false. Now based on the value of this boolean property, we will show and hide the component pop-up inside this form here. For that, let's add the component here, pop-up. First of all, we have title. Into that we can pass this list of orders. Now it expects the state boolean property open pop-up and its set function. Open pop-up is equal to order list visibility, and then we have set open pop-up, set order list visibility. So here we have the pop-up. Within this tag here we can pass whatever we want to show inside this dialog content. So inside this pop-up here, we want to show this component order list. And inside that, we will be listing existing orders. For now, inside this return statement, we have two outer components, form and pop-up. So let's wrap them with this React fragment. Now let's create this component order list. And let's define a React functional component. Inside this component, we'll be showing list of existing orders. Now let's show this component within this pop-up dialog when we click on this button here. Let's add a click event to this button, and we will call this function open list of orders. Inside this function, we will just set the boolean state property order list visibility as true. So let's call this function, and into that we can pass true. Now let's try that here. Boom, that's it. So here we have the pop-up dialog. Inside that we have to show this component, new component order list. So we will just pass that as a children to this pop-up here, order list. Now let's try that again. We must see this div with this text. So here it is. Now inside this new component, we have to fetch existing orders. We will fetch the existing orders when this component is fully loaded. So we will do this, use effect, and here we have the callback function. As a second parameter, we will be passing an empty array. So this is corresponding to component did mount in class-based components. Now in order to retrieve existing orders, we will make a get request into this web API method here. Now let's try that here, execute. So here we have the order details that we have just inserted. Now let's make the same get request within this callback function here. For that, first of all, let's import the API function, create API endpoints, and then let's import this constant object endpoints. Now we can do this, create endpoints, into that we need to pass the order endpoint. From that, we just need to call this fetch all function. And if everything went successful, it will be handled within this then function. If there is any error, we can handle that within this catch function here. So here we have the success callback. Retrieved list of orders will be there inside this object data property. So let's print that here. Let me save this and back to the application here. Reload this page. Sorry, we forgot to import useEffect. Let me open this console window. Now click on this button here. So here we have the response from our getWeb method, and here we have the array with the single order that we have just made. Using this array of orders, we will be listing order summaries inside this component here. For that, we need one more information, which is customer name. As per the current getWeb method in our order component, it does not return customer details. Only the customer ID is returned. So in order to retrieve the customer details, let's update the corresponding getWeb method. So here we have the order controller, and here is the web method that we are talking about. In previous tutorial, we have already discussed this model order masters. Inside that, we have this navigational property customer, with which we have created the foreign key between this master table and customer table. Now we can use the same navigational property to fetch the corresponding details. For that, we just need to do this. Before converting this collection into a list, we can call another function, include. Inside that, we will be passing an arrow function like this. And here we are just saying we just need to include details of customer inside this customer navigational property. Now with this change, let's build this project again. After successful build, back to the application here. Let's try to make the same GET request again. Now this time, we should see the corresponding customer details also. Boom. So here we have the navigational property customers. Inside that, we have customer details like customer ID and customer name. Now we must see the same inside this console also. Let me reload this page. Click on this button. So here we have the corresponding order object. And here we have the additional customer informations. Now back to the application, let's save this array of orders inside a state object. First of all, let me import use state function here, and let's define a state object or array, order list and corresponding set function. Let's initialize that with an empty array. Now let's update the same inside this success function here. Now we have to render these collections of array within a table. For that, first of all, we will be creating one more reusable layout component as per the app structure here, table. So let's create that here. In order to save the time, I will just paste the component here. In order to apply some styles to this component, we have defined this function use styles, and we have assigned those styles into this object classes here. From this component, we have just returned this table, and inside that, whatever we have passed as a children to this component will be displayed within this tag here. So with this component table here, we have just applied some styles to this component. So now when we use this table across our application, these same styles will be applied. So here we have just created a wrapper for table component. Now let's import the same here, order list. Now let's use this table here. First of all, we have the table head from Material UI. And then inside that, we have a single draw for head cells. So table draw. Now let's add table cell for each column. First of all, we have order number. Now let me duplicate this for remaining columns. Customer. And then we have payment method. And then finally we have grand total. We will be adding one more table cell here for action buttons. We will keep this header cell as empty. Now here we have the table body. In order to show the table rows, we will be iterating through this array order items. So we can do this order list. From that we can call this map function. Inside that we have a callback function with this single parameter item. From this function we'll be returning table row. So here it is, table row. Since we are creating these table rows within this iteration, we have to provide a unique key property here. So let's set the key property. For that I will be using order master ID. Inside this first cell we have to show the order number. So here it is, item dot order number. Now let me copy this and pasting for other columns. After order number we have customer name, which is there inside this property customer object. Inside that we have this property customer name. So the property customer name is nested within this object customer. So we have to do this customer dot customer name. Then we have payment method, so p method. And finally we have grand total. And inside this last cell we will be showing an icon for delete operation. So here we have the table cell. Now let's search for an icon. Let's search for delete and let's select this two-tone style here and let's use this delete icon here. Let me copy this import statement and let's paste that up above. So here we have the delete icon. Now I will set the color here as secondary. So in Material UI, secondary will have a reddish color. Now that's enough. Let me save this and back to the application here. Let's close this and let's try it again. Boom. So here we have the table populated with summary of the order that we have just created. Now let's check this table again after adding one more order. Now to close this dialog here, we just need to click on this icon. It's already programmed in our reusable layout component dialog. Now let me add one more order here. Submit the form. Hope it went successful. The form controls are set to their initial state. Now let's check this table again. That's it. So here we have the new order for August Leo. Now let's look how to implement update operation. For that, first of all, user want to click on this row here and then corresponding order details should be populated inside this form. And then after making required changes inside these controls, user can submit the form for updating the order. So first of all, let's add the click event for these rows. And within that, we have to populate the corresponding order details inside this form here. For that, we need a state variable for saving current order inside this form here. For update operation, there will be a non-zero value, and for insert operation, the ID will be 0. So let's define the state variable inside this form component here. Order ID and corresponding set function set order ID. And let's initialize that with 0. Now we have to update this order ID variable with the order master ID when we click on this row here. So I will be passing this state object or variable set function to our order list component here. And we will do that in object fashion. So here we have the object and let's use the separator operator here. Inside that we can pass the set function. Now let's extract the same inside this order list component. Here we have the props parameter and from that let's extract the same. Now I'm gonna add a function to handle this raw click event. So here it is. Show for update For this function, we have a single parameter ID, and inside this function, we just need to set the order ID. So let's call this function. Into that, we just need to pass this ID. Rest of the things like populating these form controls here can be done inside our form component. And also, when we click on this, we have to close this dialog here. For that, we have to reset this Boolean state property order list visibility here. So let's pass this function into this component here. Now let's extract the same inside this order list. And we will reset the corresponding Boolean variable here, and thereby we could close the dialog. We will be passing that into these table cells here, except the delete table cell. So on click, inside that we have this default parameter E, and here we have an arrow function for calling the same function. Show for update can be called here. Into this function, we just need to pass the order master ID. So let me copy this from here and pasting here. Now let's copy this on click event from here and pasting the same for rest of these table cells here. Back to the application. Let's try that here. Boo. So it should have updated the order ID. Now based on that ID, we have to populate the order details inside this form. Now we will do that inside this form component with the help of useEffect function. So I will do this useEffect. Inside that we have this callback function, and this callback function will be invoked whenever there is a change of value inside this state variable order ID. So let's pass that inside this array. Now inside the callback function, first of all we will check the value of order ID. If it is equal to 0, we will reset these form controls to their initial value. For that, we can call this function reset form controls. If there is a non-zero value inside the ID, meaning we have to fetch the corresponding order and we have to populate the same inside these form controls here. Now, in order to fetch details of an order with given ID, we can call this getWeb method with the ID. Now, if we want to retrieve the last inserted order details, we could do this. We just need to pass the ID here. Now let's check that here. 3. So let me pass the same here. Click on execute. So here we have the response. Now let's call this same getWeb method here. We have already imported API methods create API endpoint. So let's use the same here. Create API endpoint. Into that we have to pass the order endpoint, and from that we have to call this function fetch by ID. Into this function we just need to pass the ID here, order ID, and here we have the success function, and here we have the callback function. If there is any error, it will be handled within this error callback. For now, let me print the response data. Now back to the application. Let me open the developer console. Now let's try that again. Let's click on this first order here. Boo. So here we have the order details for the selected row. Now we have to make some modifications inside this return response. For that, back to the web API here, and here we have the order controller, and we have just called this web API method here. From this web API method, we need a JSON object corresponding to the order, which we can directly assign to the state object values. So here we have the object values. Properties inside this object is used to bind these controls here. So if the response from this web API method has all of the properties that we have here, we can just directly assign the same into this values object so that we can easily populate the form with corresponding order details. First of all, let me get rid of this default entity framework code from here. Now first of all, we will retrieve the food items from order details table. And then after that, we will retrieve the summary of the order from order masters. So here we are trying to retrieve the array that we used to store inside this array order details. And we have added food items into this array from this component search food items. So it should contain these properties. So we will do this. First of all, let me declare a variable order details. And here we will be using link queue expression. First of all, I will use this avoid keyword since we have an async method here, and we can have the link queue expression within this pair of brackets. So inside this web method parameter ID, we will be having the order master details ID. Now in order to retrieve the corresponding ID order details, we have to join master and details table. So here is the corresponding link queue expression from. Then we will provide an alias name master in context dot set function can be called, which is of the type order master. And we will join that with another table named as detail. And here we have to pass the details model. So let me copy this and pasting here. Instead of order master, we have order detail. Now let's specify the condition for joining these two entities. On master dot order master ID equals detail dot order master ID. Now from the join table, we will look for the ID that we have here. So master dot order master ID is equal to the ID that we have passed into this web API method. Now from that, we just need to select few columns. So we can do this. We will be returning a new object like this. First of all, we need the master ID here. So master dot order master ID. And then after that, we need details ID. Then food item ID. It will be there inside the details table. So detail dot food item ID. Then quantity, which is also there inside the details table. And then we have food item price. Finally, we need one more information, which is the name of the food item. It's not there in any of these entities, order master or order details. It's there inside this entity or table food item. So we will do one more join operation with the food item ID inside this details table here. So here it is, join, and here we have the alias name for the table, and let's specify the corresponding entity food item here. And here we have the join condition, detail dot food item ID equals food item dot food item ID. Now we can have this food item name from this table food item here. So food item dot food item name. That's it. And finally, we have to convert this result into a list. For that, we will call this function to list async. Finally, inside this variable, we will be having a collection of food items added into this given order. Now we have to retrieve the order master details here. For that, I will define another variable order master, and let's add the avoid keyword here. Now here we have the link queue expression. We have a table A, which is our master table. So let me copy this and pasting here. From this table, we have to retrieve the record with the given ID. Now let's select the required columns from this table here. First of all, we need order master ID. So this object should be corresponding to this state object here, values. So it should contain these properties. First of all, we have the master ID, and then after that we have order number, then customer ID, payment method, grand total, and finally we need one more property which is not there inside this array order masters. It's a property called delete order items ID. We will be using this property for update operation. So I will just copy this name from here and then let's use that here. and we'll be assigning empty string into this property. So here we have all of the property except this last array here. We already retrieved the records for this order details here. Now let's pass that along with this master details. Order details is equal to the order details that we have retrieved here. Now finally we have to call this function first or default async. So inside this variable we have all of the information regarding our given order ID. Now in order to return the same from this web API method, we could do this. We will pass the same within this function OK. So this function will return this object and with a status code 200. Now let me save this and build this project again. After successful build, back to the application. Now here we have the same response before updating the web API method. Now let's try the web API method again. Boom, that's it. So here we have the order summary, and inside this array order details we have selected food items. Now we can directly assign this response into the values state object, and then it will be populated inside these form controls here. So back to the component order form. So here we have the get request to the particular web API method. Here we have the response from the web API method. Let's assign that directly to the values state object. For that we can call this function set values. So it will populate the corresponding form controls. In order to clear existing error validations, we can call this function set errors. And we will reset that with an empty object like this. Let's save this and back to the application. Let's try to update an existing record. Boom, that's it. Now user can make required changes inside these form controls and then submit the form for update operation. But we should be really careful about these details record here, because there could be three types of details record. First, therefore, we will be having records which are already added into the order. After update operation, there could be some changes in their values also, like this quantity here. And then we have second types of record in which records are newly added during the update operation like this. Now in order to understand whether a food item is newly added or not, we could check the corresponding order details ID. While adding food items in this search component here, we have set the order details ID as 0. So newly added food items ID will be 0, and that of already inserted records will be a non-zero value. So with that property we can identify whether a record is newly added or not. And then we have the third types of records, which includes food items already added into the order but they are deleted during the update operation like this. In order to save such deleted food items, we have this property deleted order item IDs. Now let's save deleted food items ID into this property. We could do that inside this button click event. So let's open the corresponding component ordered food items. Here we have the corresponding icon click event remove food item. Into this function along with the index, we have already passed the details ID. Now let's modify the function accordingly. First of all, in order to identify whether this food item is already added into the order or not, we can check the ID here. If this details ID is not equal to 0, we can say that it's already added into the order. Now let's update the corresponding property here, deleted order item IDs. So we could do this x dot deleted order item IDs. Initially this property is an empty string. Upon deleting existing food items, we will append corresponding IDs into this property here. And finally, we just need to separate them with a comma like this. Now we can even simplify this syntax here, because on both ends we have the same property, so we just need to do this. And here we have set the values state object with these modifications. In order to update an existing order, we have this put web method here. We have not tested this web API in previous tutorial. Let's check that here. So here we have the put web API method. Into it, we have to pass the ID of the order which is to be updated, and the updated order details will be passed with this parameter order masters. It has two parameters. Inside this first ID parameter, will be having the ID order ID, and then the updated order details will be there inside this order master. First, therefore, we will compare the ID here and the order master's ID within this object. If they are not equal, a bad request response will be sent back. If they are equal, we will set the state of this model entity as modified. And that's how we tell entity framework we need to update this record. And then we have called this function save changes to actually update the same in physical DB. Within this catch block here, it will handle concurrency update. In brief, when multiple users try to update same record at a given time, only one of the requests will be successful and rest of them will end up in this concurrency exception here. And finally, we will return this no content here, meaning after successful update operation, we are not returning anything. Now this would work perfectly fine for master detail entity. But in case of details record, we have to do that manually by considering those three types of records. So first of all, we need a property corresponding to this property deleted order item IDs. So let's add the same inside this master model here, which is a property of the type string, and I will name this property as deleter order item IDs with the capital D because we are using Pascal case properties for C# class properties. And this property is just to receive the data from our client side here. So we have to mark this property with not mapped attribute. Otherwise, in next migration, there would be a column corresponding to this property here. That's not what we want. Okay, that's enough. Now back to this put web method here. Let's update order details record along with the master here. First, therefore, we will consider existing food items and newly added food items. For that, we will iterate through them with this for each. Order, detail, and we have the array of food items inside this order master within this property order details. Now first of all, we will check whether the record is newly added or not. For that, we could do this item dot order details ID. If it is equal to 0, we have to add the record into our details table. For that, we could do this context dot order details dot add. Into that, we can pass this item. If it's not a new food item, we just need to set the status as modified so that if there is a modification, it will be updated in the corresponding table. So we could do this entry item, and we will set the state as modified. And then after that, we have deleted food items. Here also we have a for each loop. Loop iteration variable will be I, and here we are going to iterate through the IDs that we have deleted from our client side. So which is the inside this property deleted order item IDs. We have updated the same within this remove food item here. Okay, so we just need to separate those IDs with this comma here. So in C# we could do this order master. Inside that, we have this property deleted order items IDs. Now let's split its value by comma. So it will return an array of items. When we do this, there would be an extra empty string at the end because this string, this concatenated string, will end up with a comma. So there would be an extra white space. In order to avoid that, we could do this where x is not equal to an empty string. Now inside this iteration, we can delete such order details record. So first of all, we have to retrieve the corresponding record. Y is equal to context dot order details dot find function can be called, and we have to retrieve the corresponding record with the given ID. Inside that, let's pass the details ID here. First of all, we have to convert the same into long data type. So convert to int64, and let's pass the same here. So this will retrieve the corresponding order details record into this variable here. Now in order to delete the same, we just need to do this context dot order details dot remove function can be called. Inside that, let's pass this record. All of these modifications up above here will be affected within the database by calling this function save changes. Now let me save this and let's build this project again. After successful build, back to the application here. Now within this form submit event, we have to make the put request. So here we have the form, and here is the function to handle the form submit event. Inside that, we have already called the post web method for insert operation. In order to check whether we have an insert or update operation, we can check the order master ID. So we could do this values dot order master ID. If it is equal to 0, then we will go for insert operation, otherwise we can do the update operation. So here we have the else part. Inside that, we will do the update operation. For that, we have to call the put web method inside this create API endpoint. So here is the function update. Within that, we will make the put request. Into this function, we have to pass the master ID and then the updated form data. So first of all, I will copy this code from here and pasting that here for update operation. Instead of create, we have to call update. Along with this values object, we have to pass the master ID. So values dot order master ID. And then after successful update operation, we have to reset the form here. For that, we just need to set the order ID here. So set order ID as 0. Inside this variable, we will be having currently opened order within this form here. If we set this order ID as 0, meaning this order should be reset to its initial state for adding new order. We have already done the same within this useEffect function here. So this callback function will be invoked whenever there is a change of value within this order ID. If the ID is equal to 0, then we will reset form controls. Now back to the application, let's try to update a record. While recording this video, I was testing this update operation and it was not working because I made a typo within this delete button click event. So here is the button and here we have the click event. As a second parameter, we have to pass the details ID. And here is the typo, we have typed an extra s. So let me remove that and let's save this. Now back to the application, let's try to update an existing record. So I will select this record here. Before making any modifications inside this order, let's check corresponding SQL Server rows here. So here we have the master table and this order ends with 82. So here we have the corresponding record. So master ID is 3. Now let's check the corresponding details record. So here we have the details record for the order. Now let me update this query for the specific order where order master ID is equal to 3. Let's execute this again. So here we only have those 2 food items. Now let's make few modifications inside this order. Let's change this food quantity here. Let's add a new food item and let's delete an existing item. Now let's change this payment method here. Submit the form. Boom. Since form is reset to its initial state, hope everything went successful. Let's check that inside our DB here. So here we have the record before update operation. Let me execute this query in a new tab. So here is the difference. Sorry guys, Management Studio messed up everything. I think we have recorded before and after results. Let's compare that here. So here we have the records after update operation. And before update operation, this payment method was called. Because of the changes within our food items, the grand total is also updated. And here we have the details record after update operation. So the update operation is working fine. Now finally, we have to implement this delete operation here. Before that, let's look how to show a notification message after any of these CRUD operations. Along with that, let's wire up a function for this reset button here. So back to the form component, let's define a function for reset operation, reset form. First of all, we will reset the form controls and then we will set the order ID as 0. Now let's call the same inside the reset button. So let's add this click event on click. Inside that, we can call this function reset form. Now, in order to show a notification message after CRUD operations, we are going to make a new layout component here, notification. So let's add that inside this layouts folder here, notification. In order to save the time from developing this component from scratch, I will just paste the code directly here. We have created this notification component in our Material UI tutorial. Into this component, we need to pass a state object, and here we have the corresponding set function. We have applied these custom styles through this class's object. In order to show the notification, we have this snack bar component, and the message for this notification is shown within this alert here. This notification will be hidden after 3 seconds, and here we have set this style, and this notification will be shown only when this property is open from this notify object is true. We have set the position. Upon closing this notification, this function handle close will be called. Inside that, we will just close this notification by updating this boolean property is open as false. Now you should know this alert component is imported from this package Material UI Lab. So first of all, we have to install the corresponding package. So let's open terminal, npm i4 install, and then here we have the package. Hit enter. So here we have done with the installation. Now let's show this notification after submitting this form here for both insert and update operation. So first of all, let's import the same inside this order form here. Import statement. From layouts folder, we have to import notification. So that's done. Now let's define a state object to handle this notification. So here it is, notify, and corresponding set function set notify. And let's initialize that here. Initially it would be an object and it contains a property is open, and I will reset that with false. Now let's add a tag for the component notification here. Into this, we have to pass the state object and corresponding set function. So I will do this, notify and set notify. Now let's show a notification after insert and update operation. So here is the function to handle form submit event. In order to show a notification, we just need to set the notify state object. So here it is. I will set is open as true. And then we need to pass the message within this property. New order is created. Now let's do the same inside this update operation also. The order is updated. Let me save this and back to the application. Now let's check whether this reset operation is working or not. It's working. Now in order to see the notification that we have just created, let's try to update and exit in the code as it is. Submit the form, boom. So here we have the notification message. Now we have to implement the final operation delete within this icon click event. So here we have the corresponding component order list. First of all, let me define a function for the click event, delete order. Into this function, we just need to pass the ID, order master ID. We have to implement a delete operation. So before that, we have to confirm the operation from user side. So window.confirm function can be called. It will open up a dialog asking whether you want to delete or not. Are you sure to delete this record? If user confirm the operation, we will do the delete operation. In order to delete an order, we can call this web method delete here. And here we have the corresponding web API method. Using this given order master ID, it will find the corresponding master record and it will delete the record. We already have a foreign key with the details table where we have the delete cascade rule. So whenever we delete an order, at the same time corresponding records from details table will also be deleted. So that's cool. Now let's call this delete web method from our React application here. So first of all, we have to make use of the API function create API endpoints, which we have already called here. So let me copy this and pasting here for delete operation. Instead of fetch all, we have to call delete function. Into this function, we have to pass the ID, and here we have the success callback. This delete operation is called from within this dialog here. So first of all, after successful delete, we have to close the dialog. For that, we could do this set order list visibility as false. After delete operation, we also need to reset these form controls here. For that, first of all, I will set this order ID state object order ID to 0. So we have already passed this function into this component set order ID, and let's set that with 0. Along with that, we have to call this function reset form controls. So here we have the reset form controls passed from our parent component. Now let's pass the same into this order list component. Let's extract the same here. Now let's call that here. So this is enough for the delete operation. After delete operation, also we want to show the notification message. Now in order to show notification after delete operation, we can use the same notification that we have inside this order form here, because we have shown this order list component within this form here inside this pop-up. So we could pass corresponding set function here, set notify. Now let's extract the same within our list component here. Now let me copy this statement from our submit event here. Inside the notification, we will be having this message deleted successfully. Now let me save this and back to the application here. Actually, during testing this operation, I have deleted existing orders. So currently there is no order to test the delete operation. So I will create new order here. Submit the form. So here we have created a new order. Let's delete that. Confirm the operation. Boom. So that's it, guys. Now after building this project from scratch, I have some recommendations. You might have already noticed that we have created all of the form related objects within this parent, and from there we have shared the same with other components here. You could considerably reduce the number of shared properties if you can use state management libraries like Redux, Context API, etc. We have already discussed Redux in great detail in one of my previous video. You could check that from video description. I was not planning for state management libraries for this project because, as you know, already this tutorial is a long one. If we were using state management libraries, this video will be even longer. So I strongly recommend state management libraries for a project like this. Now here is my second point. When we create reusable components with the same name as that of Material UI components, for example, inside this controls folder we have input, button, select. And then within layouts we have form, table. At the same time we have components in Material UI with these same names. In order to identify these custom React components from Material UI components, we can add some prefix. For example, you could name these components like MUI input, MUI button, etc. In that way, we can avoid conflicts with Material UI components without using this alias name here. Instead of using this MUI here, try to use that for naming this component here itself. And thereby, you could easily say that this is a custom component created using corresponding Material UI components or controls. And here is my last advice. Try to name these components with meaningful names. And also consider when you open all of these components within these tabs here, each components from open tabs must be easily distinguishable. So naming this parent component with index is a big no. Try to use a meaningful name. You could download this whole project from GitHub, link given below in video description, and you could use the same in your future projects also. In order to help me to make more videos like this, you can support me through PayPal donation. I have given the link in video description and inside the first comment of this video. If you found this video helpful, please thumbs up this video, and for more videos like this, please be subscribed to this channel, CodAffection, and please share this video with your friends and colleagues so that they can also benefit from this. Have a nice day. Bye.